Hey guys, this is The Flight of Redbird, The Life of Zitkala-Sa. Winyan, woman. Often after breakfast, Mother began her beadwork. On a clear day, she pulled out the wooden pegs that pinned the skirt of our wigwam to the ground and rolled the canvas partway up on its frame of slender poles. The cool morning breezes swept freely through our dwelling, now and then bringing the perfume of sweet grasses from newly burned prairie. Untying the long tasseled strings of a small brown buckskin bag, my mother spread bunches of colored beads on a mat as an artist arranges paints on a palette. On a lapboard, she smoothed out a double sheet of soft white buckskin. From a beaded case hanging on her wide belt, she drew a long, narrow blade and cut the buckskin. I felt my playmates' envious eyes on the pretty red beaded moccasins that would soon decorate my feet. I sat on a rug with a scrap of buckskin in one hand and an owl in the other, and watched my mother. This was the beginning of my lessons in the art of beadwork. From a skein of finely twisted threads of silvery sinews, my mother pulled out a single one. With an awl, she pierced the buckskin and skillfully threaded it with the white sinew. Picking up the tiny beads one by one, she strung them with the point of her thread, always twisting it carefully after every stitch. It took many trials before I learned how to knot my thread on the point of my finger, as I saw her do. The next difficulty was in keeping my thread stiffly twisted, so I could easily string my beads upon it. My mother insisted I make original designs. At first, I spent many a sunny hour working a long design. Soon, I learned not to draw complex patterns, for I had to finish whatever I began. I usually drew simple crosses and squares. My original designs were not always symmetrical, nor sufficiently characteristic, two faults with which my mother had little patience. She treated me as a dignified little individual, as long as I was on my good behavior. I felt terribly humiliated when some boldness of mine drew forth a rebuke from her. After these confining lessons, I was wild, with surplus spirits, and found joyous relief in running with my playmates over the hills. Many a summer afternoon, we each carried a sharpened rod about 4 feet long to pry up sweet roots. After eating the choice roots, we strayed off into patches of a stocky plant under whose yellow blossoms are found little crystal drops of gum. Drop by drop, we gathered nature's rock candy until each of us had a lump the size of a small bird egg. We chewed it and chewed it. Soon, sated with its woody flavor, we tossed away our gum and returned to find more sweet roots. We pretended to give each other our necklaces, beaded belts, and moccasins as gifts. We delighted in impersonating our mothers. We talked of things we had heard them say in their conversations. We imitated their various manners, even to the inflection of their voices. We seated ourselves, leaned our cheeks in the palms of our hands, rested our elbows on our knees, and bent forward as they did. When one of us told of some heroic deed recently done by a near relative, the rest of us listened attentively and exclaimed, "Han, Han, yes, yes," whenever the speaker paused for breath or sympathy. As our discourse began more thrilling, our Han-Hans were louder and louder. No matter how exciting the tale, the mere shifting of a cloud shadow in the landscape was sufficient to make us take off and chase it on the hills. We shouted and whooped in the chase, laughing and calling to one another as we ran along, hoping to catch the shadow. White men's lies. The first turning away from the easy, natural flow of my life occurred in 1884, when I was 8. At this age, I knew... Sorry, there's a little mark on my page, but one language, and that was my mother's native tongue. From my playmates, I heard that 2 pale-faced missionaries were in our village. They said these men, Quakers, wore big hats and carried large hearts. I asked my mother why these strangers were among us. I pestered her until she told me that they had come to take away Indian boys and girls to the east. My mother did not seem to want me to talk about them. Some parents, resigned to the fact that their way of life was quickly vanishing, believed their children needed to be educated in white ways. But they did not want their young ones leaving them, even to go to boarding schools on the reservations. Federal agents tried persuasion. If that didn't work, food rations were withheld. To keep their other children from starving, parents gave in. Some parents hid their children, but the agency police tracked them down and dragged them out from their hiding places. Sometimes children were kidnapped, and for months parents were frantic, not knowing where they had been taken. I heard wonderful stories about the strangers from my friend Judwin. I told Mother, "Judwin is going home with the missionaries to a more beautiful country than ours. The palefaces told her so." I wished in my heart that I too might go. 3 years ago, my brother David had returned from Hampton Normal Institute, an industrial training school in Virginia. His coming back influenced my mother to take a step from her native way of living. First, it was a change from the buffalo skin covering of our wigwam to the white man's canvas. Recently, she had given up her wigwam of slender poles to live like a foreigner, in a home of clumsy logs. Yes, my child, several others besides Judwin are going away with the palefaces. Your brother said they had inquired about you. My heart thumped so hard I wondered if she could hear it. Did he tell them to take me, Mother? I asked, fearing that David had forbidden the missionaries to see me, and that my hope of going to the Wonderland would be blighted. With a sad, slow smile, she answered, Judwin has filled your ears with the white men's lies. Don't believe a word they say. Their words are sweet, my child, but their deeds are bitter. Stay with me, my little one. David says that going east will be too hard for his baby sister. The following day I spied the missionaries coming up the footpath to our house. A young interpreter who had a smattering of our language was with them. I was ready to run out to meet them, but I did not dare displease my mother. I jumped up and down on the floor. I begged my mother to open the door so that they would be sure to come to us. When they came, they smiled into my eyes and patted my head. I wondered how Mother could say such hard words against these kind strangers. Judwin had told me that they lived in the east, in a land of great trees filled with red apples. You could reach out your hands and pick all the red apples you could eat there. I had never seen apple trees. I had never tasted more than a dozen red apples in my life. I was eager to see these orchards. Mother, ask them if little girls may have all the red apples they want when they go east, I whispered aloud. The interpreter answered, Yes, little girl, the nice red apples are for those who pick them, and you will ride on the iron horse if you go with these good people. I had never seen a train, and he knew it. Mother, I like big red apples, and I want to ride on the iron horse. Mother, say yes, I pleaded. My mother said nothing. The missionaries waited in silence. My eyes began to blur with tears, though I struggled to choke them back. The corners of my mouth twitched. Mother told the missionaries that she would give them her answer tomorrow. They left us. Alone with my mother, I yielded to my tears, shaking my head so as not to hear what she said to me. This was the first time I had ever been so unwilling to give up my own desire that I refused to listen to my mother. There was a solemn silence in our home that night. Before I went to bed, I begged the Great Spirit to make my mother let me go. The next morning, my dear aunt came to the house. I hoped that, as usual, my aunt was pleading on my behalf. My mother called me to her side. Do you still persist in wishing to leave your mother? She asked. Mother, it is not that I wish to leave you, but I want to see the wonderful eastern land. My aunt said, Let her try it. Mother turned to my aunt, but she does not understand what it all means. I know she will suffer keenly in this experiment, so I dread letting her go. A few days later, wrapped up in my heavy blanket, I walked with Mother to the carriage that would take us to the iron horse. I was happy. My playmates were also wearing their best thick blankets. We showed one another our new beaded moccasins and the width of the belts around our new dresses. There were 8 in our party, 3 young boys, 2 tall girls, Judwin, our friend, Totowin, and I. We dreamed of roaming as freely and happily under a sky of rosy apples as we had chased the cloud shadows on the Dakota plains. We rode several days inside the Iron Horse. It was night when we reached the grounds of White's Manual Labor Institute in Wabash, Indiana. The wagon pulled up in front of a massive brick building. The lights from its windows fell upon some of the icicle trees that stood beneath them. We were led toward an open door where the brightness of the lights within flooded out. My body trembled. Once we were inside, the glaring light in the large whitewashed hall dazzled my eyes. The noisy hurrying of hard shoes on the bare wooden floor increased the whirring in my ears. My only safety seemed to be keeping next to the wall. As I was wondering how to escape from all of this confusion, 2 warm hands grasped me firmly and tossed me up in the air. A rosy-cheeked woman caught me in her arms. I was both frightened and insulted by such trifling. I stared into her eyes, wishing her to let me stand on my own feet. But she jumped me up and down with increasing enthusiasm. My mother had never made me a plaything. Remembering this, I began to cry aloud. The woman misunderstood why I was crying and placed me at a table loaded with food. As I did not stop crying, one of the older Indian girls at the table whispered to me, "Wait until you are alone." "I want my mother and my brother, and I want my aunt," I pleaded in my language. But the ears of the pale faces could not hear me. We were taken up an incline of wooden boxes, which I later learned to call a stairway. At the top was a quiet, dimly lighted hall. Many narrow beds with sleeping brown faces peeping out of the coverings lined the wall. I was tucked into bed with one of the tall girls. She talked to me in my mother tongue, and it soothed me. I had arrived in the wonderful land of rosy skies, but I was not happy as I thought I would be. My long travel and the bewildering sights had exhausted me. I fell asleep, heaving deep, tired sobs. My tears were left to dry themselves in streaks because neither my aunt nor my mother was there to wipe them away. The first day at school. The first day in the land of red apples was a bitter cold one. Snow still covered the ground, and the trees were bare. A large bell rang for breakfast, its loud metallic voice crashing through the belfry overhead into our sensitive ears several hours before sunrise. The annoying clatter of shoes gave us no peace. The constant clash of harsh noises with many voices murmuring an unknown tongue made a bedlam within, which I was securely tied. And though my spirit tore itself in struggling for its lost freedom, all was useless. A woman with white hair came for us. We were placed in a line with other Indian girls dressed in stiff shoes and closely clinging dresses. The small girls wore sleeved aprons and had shingled, close-cropped and layered hair. I felt like sinking to the floor, for my blanket had been stripped from my shoulders. I looked hard at the Indian girls who had been here a while. They seemed not to care that they were even more immodestly dressed than I in their tight-fitting clothes. In the dining room I spied the 3 boys from home, looking as uncomfortable as I felt. A small bell was tapped, and each pupil drew a chair from under the table. I assumed this meant we could sit, so pulled out my chair and slipped into it. But when I turned my head, I saw that I was the only one seated. I rose, looking shyly around to see how the chairs were to be used when a second bell sounded. All were seated at last. I had to crawl back into my chair again. I heard a man's voice at one end of the hall and looked around to see him. All the other heads were bent over their plates. As I glanced at the long chain of tables, I caught the eyes of a pale-faced woman upon me. Immediately I dropped my eyes, wondering why I was so keenly watched by the strange woman. The man ceased his mutterings, and a third bell was tapped. Everyone picked up his knife and fork and began eating. I began crying instead, for by this time I was afraid to venture anything more. Later in the morning, Judwin gave me a terrible warning. She knew a few words of English and had overheard the woman talk about cutting our long hair. Our mothers had taught us that only unskilled warriors who were captured had their hair shingled by the enemy. Among our people, short hair was worn by mourners and shingled hair by cowards. We discussed our fate some moments, and Judwin said, "We have to submit because they are strong." "No, I will not submit. I will struggle first," I answered. I watched for my chance, and when no one noticed, I disappeared. I crept up the stairs as quietly as I could in my squeaking shoes, for after breakfast my moccasins had been taken from me and exchanged for shoes. I did not know where I was going. Turning aside to an open door, I saw into a large room with 3 beds. The windows were covered with dark green curtains, which made the room dim. I crawled under the bed and cuddled myself in the dark corner. From my hiding place, I peered out, shuddering with fear whenever I heard footsteps nearby. In the hall, loud voices were calling my name. I knew that even Judwin was searching for me. I did not open my mouth to answer. The steps quickened, and the voices became excited. The sounds came nearer and nearer. Women and girls entered the room. I held my breath and watched them open closet doors and peep behind large trunks. Someone threw up the curtains, and the room was filled with sudden light. What caused them to stoop and look under the bed, I do not know. I remember being dragged out, though I resisted by kicking and scratching wildly. I was carried downstairs and tied fast in a chair. I cried aloud, shaking my head all the while I felt the cold blades of the scissors against my neck and heard them gnaw off one of my thick braids. Then I lost my spirit. Since I had been taken from my mother, I had suffered extreme indignities. People had stared at me. I had been tossed about in the air like a wooden puppet, and now my long hair was being shingled like a coward's. I moaned for my mother, but no one came to comfort me. Not a soul reasoned quietly with me as my mother would have done, for now I was only one of many little animals driven by a herder.